Hey, everybody. So we're looking at section 18.3, which is about something called speciation, which is kind of a funky term in evolution. But what we're talking about here is how we get different species that are coming from originally one kind of common ancestor. All right. And so we're going to add to what we've been talking about and continue looking at populations and how they change over time. And now we're going to kind of hone in on that and look at exactly, what kind of drives that process. And as part of that, we're going to talk about things called isolating mechanisms. Let me pull this back up. All right. So in terms of this section, we move on. So we've got learning objectives, and we've just got two. So I told you we're going to look at isolating mechanisms, and that's going to be kind of where we begin and looking at how we form new species. And then we're going to use an example about the finches found on the Galapagos Islands, which we've talked about a lot, to look at exactly how all of this data fits into our conception, our understanding of these processes of natural selection and evolution. Okay. So when we look at isolating mechanisms, that whole phrase to me always makes me think of, things that are happening kind of on their own, things that are impacting populations in a way that's kind of separating them further, right? And so what we know from this, back in 18.2, we talked about this process called gene flow. Remember, gene flow is where we have movement of alleles between populations. And that happens because we have immigration with an I, individuals moving into a population, or emigration with an E, individuals exiting or leaving a population. Now, if we have two groups that maybe started out as one kind of cohesive population, but for whatever reason become separated, we would say in that case that immigration and emigration would both stop. And so that would mean we would have little to no gene flow. Now, when we lack that gene flow component, not only do we kind of change how natural selection happens, but we also are going to become more and more different in those different locations. Okay. So the populations we say are isolated if there is no gene flow kind of occurring between them. And over time, what we see is that isolated populations will become more and more different from one another as they adapt to their environment, right? To the changes in that space. So there's a really great example of salamanders out in California. All of these diverged and originally came from one kind of ancestral population, which you can see there towards the top of the image. And then as they kind of started to fill and occupy these different niches in different parts of California and move into new habitats, they became more and more different from one another. And so gene flow kind of halted. And as a result of that, you can see we have lots of different traits being expressed currently in these different populations, so much so that they are now entirely separate species. They no longer have the ability to mate and produce fertile offspring. So over time, again, this isolation has kind of promoted and coaxed along this process of natural selection. Okay. So when we think about these isolating mechanisms, what we say will happen if we have two populations that become separated from one another in this way, where there is no more gene flow, they become what we call reproductively isolated, which means that they can't reproduce and create offspring with each other. There's something that's kind of barring that from happening. And over time, what can occur as a result of that is our populations can become so different that they form into different species, just like we saw here on this slide, right? The different groups of salamanders are also different now that they can no longer mate, so they're considered different species. And that can happen really within any population if isolation occurs. But again, you have to have this factor of time that occurs, right? That's also separating them, in addition to that lack of gene flow. So we call this process where we actually create new species, we call it speciation, which is really just a fancy term for forming a new species. Okay. And so in order to get this process happening, again, you have to have those isolating kind of processes. All right. So when reproductive isolation occurs, like you see on the slide, that's when things become more and more different, right? So those isolated gene pools diverge into two separate species. And this is actually something that we call divergent evolution, where things become more and more different. Okay. So when we think about reproductive isolation, there are several different what we call barriers or factors that can lead to populations becoming reproductively isolated. And the three that you see listed there at the bottom, 1, 2, and 3, are going to be the three that we go through here on the next few slides. So these are going to be maybe the most important part of this section, is understanding how these isolation kind of barriers drive this process of speciation. What I like about these different factors that we're looking at, 1, 2, and 3, is that they're named very well. It's 100% named according to what they're gonna be and what they do. So when we hear behavioral isolation, it has to do with the species behavior. When we hear geographic isolation, that has to do with location and geography. And then we hear temporal, that's probably a word that you're not as familiar with, but temporal has everything to do with time. And so temporal isolation is going to have something to do with the timing in terms of when these individual groups are trying to reproduce and create offspring. Okay. But all three of these together or separately can lead to what we're calling reproductive isolation. Okay. So we're going to talk about them individually right here. And then we're going to come back and use Darwin's examples with the Galapagos finches to kind of, provide some real tangible examples of this stuff. So behavioral isolation, like I mentioned, is where we have differences in the behaviors among two different populations. So again, remember, keep in mind, we're starting with one ancestral population, and we're looking at how those can be separated in a way that makes them eventually form two different species. So with behavioral isolation, we're looking at changes in courtship or mating behavior specifically, not other types of behaviors like hunting or anything else. We're looking at specifically how these groups try to reproduce. And so in terms of what fits into that category, well, there are certain birds and fish that have really specific behaviors that kind of promote mating among that group, that species. Birds are kind of exceptional at this. There are all sorts of videos of birds of paradise. If you Google birds of paradise, you will see all sorts of what look like kind of crazy courtship dances and songs and different physical traits that those birds have started to develop over time to try and attract those of the opposite sex. And so when we think about behavioral isolation, my mind always goes to birds because they are kind of the best at doing this. But what that means is that based on the song, based on a dance, based on the physical appearance of these things, right? They're going to be very selective and very particular about the types of birds that, for example, a female bird would find attractive in a male. Okay. And so as a species, if they become separated for whatever reason and they start to develop these different behaviors, that can lead to this reproductive isolation kind of process happening. So the cartoon at the bottom, which I kind of like, there's a blue male bird there that's singing some song, and the female there is saying, ugh, country, because clearly his song is not something that she's impressed by, right? So that would just be kind of an example of that. All right. So behavioral isolation is that specifically, what is that population doing in order to attract a mate? And is it successful in terms of attracting everybody, the original population? Geographic isolation is the next one. It's the middle graphic there on the bottom. And this is where we have physical barriers that are going to separate two populations. So these include rivers, mountains, canyons, oceans, lakes, almost any type of, geographical kind of feature that you think could potentially cause something to physically become separated now. Okay, so behavior is not a physical separation, but geographic is. So these are things that are now living in different locations. And so the Grand Canyon is a great example of that. There are squirrel populations on either side of the Grand Canyon that we believe, that biologists believe, started as one kind of original ancestral species. And over time, as that Grand Canyon formed and became larger and larger and larger, well, the canyon becomes impassable. And so as a result, those squirrels become more and more different. They adapt to their environments and they essentially completely halt gene flow so that, again, we have the speciation process happening. Similarly, we saw what we believe to be the same thing happening on the Galapagos Islands and between the Galapagos Islands. So, and that we'll come back to here in a second when we talk about finches as an example. Okay. Temporal isolation is the last one. And with temporal isolation, we're looking at a change in timing. So, a lot of times this happens in plants. We can think about, and the example down there at the bottom says, Ted, wake up. It's time to release pollen. And Ted is behind me there. But Ted says, "Oh, just give me a few more months." Like Ted's sleepy. He's not ready to go through that process yet. So, if we have plant species where they begin to differ in terms of when they become reproductive, right? When they actually release pollen and go through that process, then that's what we could call temporal isolation. Similarly, if we have populations of animals that all start out as the original group, but then we have some kind of pockets of that original group that start to maybe hibernate earlier or come out of hibernation earlier than others, then they could eventually become so different from one another that they can form different species also. So again, behavioral has to do with behaviors. Geographic has to do with location and physical barriers. And then temporal is timing. Okay. So if we look at the Galapagos finches as our example of all of these, remember, we know that our Galapagos finches came from the South American mainland, and the Galapagos Islands are a pretty good distance from the mainland. Okay, so not exactly sure how they got there, if they actually flew there with a purpose or not. Certainly, it wouldn't have been with a purpose, they wouldn't have known. But somehow they get to the Galapagos Islands. All right, and so we think biologists tend to think that the group that moved there is probably not the same in terms of allele frequencies as those as we originally saw on the mainland. And that would be evidence of those two things we talked about previously, which is the founder effect, where you have small groups that move to a place that aren't representative of that original population, and also genetic drift, which is that idea that random chance will change allele frequencies over time in an unpredictable way. So either of those two things could have happened, whether or not those birds kind of, flew there and ended up there by accident, by chance, through a tropical storm or something else. Or if it was one of those, there's a small group and for whatever reason they were able to move there on their own. But regardless of which kind of reason there was behind it, we know that throughout the Galapagos Islands, and there are many Galapagos Islands that make up this chain, um, they're also very different in terms of their landforms and their climates and so on. And part of that is driven by this idea that they are pretty separated. They're not all in close proximity. And so the populations that eventually move there may spread out among those islands, but once they reach an island, they kind of stay in that space. Now, certainly they can move back and forth, but that gene flow is going to be pretty limited. That immigration, emigration kind of idea is not really going to be happening very much. So we would say in that case, if we have a bird represented there on the right that has maybe moved there originally, and then its offspring or others of its population move over to the other larger island, we would say that these are now existing in two separate gene pools. And again, if you don't have gene flow, you're going to have a lack of those mixing of alleles, and you get a faster kind of process of speciation occurring. So over time, those populations would adapt to their local environments, right? B and A without gene flow and being separated by an island, that would be an example of geographical isolation, right? And so as that process occurs, we could get directional selection in these places, for example, where it became more beneficial to have those larger, stronger beaks, right? So we're looking at a specific example here where we're kind of going down the path of how we get to those larger, more like nut cracking, seed eating types of bird beaks, okay? But that would be a process of directional selection, right? That would be going towards one extreme, not the average size beak, but the largest beaks would be the best for survival. All right, so over time, as those beaks became more adaptive for survival, as the population changed, we could have additional reproductive isolation there. Okay, where maybe those physical characteristics are no longer attractive to the original birds. That behavior, maybe there are different behaviors that are kind of happening in each environment just based on those environmental pressures and maybe the predators present and so on. And over time, those changes in the physical characteristics and the behavior of the birds would lead to additional reproductive isolation. and that would then drive this speciation process. So we get eventually here two distinct species that form from that one original group, that one original population that first moved to these islands. And so we see again, the original group is A, and then the group B that we're seeing there is representing the new species that's formed as a result. All right. Over many generations, what we know happened as a result of that is we had many different species of these finches kind of forming as a result of reproductive isolation. So as these finches moved to new islands, adapted to those climates and to those environments, they changed in terms of not only their physical characteristics, but also likely their behaviors. And so with behavioral isolation and some geographical isolation, we had the complete kind of stoppage of gene flow and speciation occurring. So this is what we call divergent evolution again, right? We have one group becoming many different groups. So like the finches, we know that a lot of the things that exist on the earth currently have likely diverged from common ancestors as a result of different kind of selective pressures, right? Whether it's in the environment, the climate, whether it's human driven, right? If we talk about the natural world, humans have a big part in determining what's surviving in those places. So there can be a lot of different factors that can kind of push species down these pathways. All right. And that's all I've got for 18.3. So given that, if you've got any questions for me about any of this, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next time. All right. See you later.